Captain James Riker was a man used to danger. He had served in the military, seen the darkest sides of the galaxy, and come out alive. Now, he captained his own ship, traveling between star systems, carrying cargo and avoiding trouble. His life was simple, predictable, and to be honest, a bit boring.
He didn't mind. After years of fighting and surviving, he had earned the right to a quiet life.
That is, until his ship's alarms began to blare, one cold evening in deep space. "Unidentified ships approaching," his computer system said, its cold, mechanical voice filling the room. James immediately sat up from his chair. He was a man who trusted his instincts. Something about this didn't feel right. He quickly accessed his ship's radar. A fleet of enemy vessels cloaked in darkness was surrounding him. His heart skipped a beat. These were no ordinary raiders. He had seen this type of military force before, the Kavari Dominion. The most ruthless empire in the galaxy, the ones who didn't ask for permission before they attacked. They were closing in fast. James gripped the controls, his fingers moving swiftly over the dashboard. His ship, an older model, wasn't built for combat, but he was a fighter at heart. He immediately engaged the engines, pulling the ship into a sharp, evasive maneuver. The sudden speed forced the ship into a dive, dodging incoming enemy fire. The ship groaned under the pressure, but it held together. "Hold on," James muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the controls as his heart raced. Despite his best efforts, the Kavari fleet was too powerful. A blast struck the ship's hull, shaking everything inside. Sparks flew from the walls, and the lights flickered. The ship was losing altitude fast. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Captain James Riker. I am going down. Coordinates for my crash site are..." He quickly sent out a distress signal before his communication systems failed. With a loud, deafening noise, the ship slammed into the planet's surface. The world outside was dark and unfamiliar. The ground cracked open beneath them. For a few seconds, everything went silent, the ship trembling as it came to a stop. The smell of burnt metal filled the air, and the sounds of alarms were all that could be heard in the cockpit. James sat there, shaken but alive. He took a deep breath, clearing the fog in his head, and checked himself for injuries. His arm ached from the sudden jolt, but nothing was broken. The ship was a wreck, but it was still standing, just barely. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his legs unsteady. He had to get out of the ship and assess the damage. The planet outside was alien, strange. There were no signs of civilization, just rocky terrain and thick clouds that covered the sky. Stepping out into the cool air, James looked around. His ship had crashed in a remote area, far from any known colonies or settlements. This was going to be a tough one. The Kavari fleet would likely search for him, but they wouldn't expect him to survive the crash. He had time. James checked his survival kit, finding a basic supply of food, water, and medical equipment. He could survive for a few days, maybe longer, but only if he found shelter. He set off across the rocky terrain, keeping his senses sharp. The planet was quiet, too quiet. As he walked, his mind raced through his options. He needed to find a way to communicate with the outside world. Maybe there was a nearby station. Maybe he could repair his ship. But that would take time. Time he didn't have. After a couple of hours of walking, he saw something in the distance, a large metallic object partially buried in the dirt. As he approached, he realized it was a ship, but it was no ordinary ship. It was clearly built for royalty. The smooth, sleek design stood in sharp contrast to the rough, rocky landscape surrounding it. Without hesitation, James approached the wreck. The hatch was slightly open, and from inside, he could see the faint glow of alien technology. It was a strange sight, but there was no time to question it. Whoever this ship belonged to might have valuable resources, or at least a way off the planet. He crouched down and pulled open the hatch, stepping inside carefully. The interior of the ship was even more magnificent. It was decorated with intricate designs that were unfamiliar to him. His eyes scanned the area, looking for signs of life. And then he saw her. In the corner of the ship, lying unconscious, was a woman, or at least, she looked human at first glance, but her skin was a glowing shade of blue, her hair long and silver. She wore an outfit made of some kind of metallic fabric, glowing faintly in the dim light. James knelt beside her, his heart racing. She wasn't dead, but she was badly injured. Her breathing was shallow, and there was a faint pulse beneath her skin. "Hey, are you okay?" James asked, shaking her gently. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him with confusion in her gaze. You saved me!" James raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like you're in a position to be talking about saving anyone." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment James felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward her. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen before. "I am Zyra," she whispered, her voice weak. "I am the princess of the Velsha dynasty." James stared at her in disbelief. A princess on this planet. It didn't make sense. But before he could ask more questions, the ship's alarm went off again, louder this time. Someone, or something, was coming, and he was going to have to protect this alien princess if he wanted to survive. James pulled Zyra away from the wrecked ship, his mind racing. The glowing lights on her skin were flickering, signaling that she was still badly injured. The ship's alarms were growing louder, indicating that someone was coming. He could hear the distant hum of engines in the air, which meant more of the enemy was closing in. "We need to move," James muttered, glancing back at the ship. He knew that staying in one place for too long was dangerous. The Kavari fleet would surely be searching the area, and he didn't want to give them any reason to find him. He grabbed her arm gently, helping her to her feet. Zyra winced in pain but didn't protest. She had a strong look in her eyes, despite her weakness.
"I can't walk fast," she said quietly, her voice weak but steady.
"I am not used to this planet." James looked around, trying to assess the situation. The landscape was rocky and desolate, but he noticed a small ridge in the distance. It might provide some cover. Without a second thought, he scooped her up into his arms. She was light, but the glow of her skin made her feel delicate, almost otherworldly.
"You're a bit heavy for someone who says they're not used to the planet,"
James said with a small chuckle, trying to break the tension. But Zyra didn't laugh. She only stared at him with wide eyes, as if studying him.
"You saved my life," she said, her tone softer now. "I should be grateful." "You can thank me later," James replied, glancing over his shoulder.
"Right now, we need to find somewhere safe." The wind howled across the planet's surface, and the distant sound of the Koveri ships grew louder. James quickened his pace, heading toward the ridge. With every step, his mind raced through options. He had no idea what he was doing. His best chance of survival was getting back to his ship, but without working communications, that seemed impossible. And as for Zyra, she was an alien princess. He had no idea how she ended up here, or what kind of trouble she was in. But one thing was clear. If he didn't protect her, they were both dead. They reached the ridge in a matter of minutes, and James found a narrow cave at its base. It was small, but deep enough to hide them for a while. He lowered Zyra gently to the ground, making sure she was comfortable. Her skin was still glowing faintly, but it seemed to be dimming. She was exhausted, and James couldn't help but feel a little guilty for pushing her so hard. "Rest here for a moment," he said, sitting down beside her. "I'll keep watch." Zyra nodded, her eyes closing as she leaned against the cave wall. She looked fragile, vulnerable, in a way that James hadn't expected from someone who claimed to be royalty. It made him wonder just how much trouble she was really in. The sound of the Kavari ships echoed across the valley, but they didn't seem to be getting any closer. James scanned the horizon, trying to gauge the distance. He knew the enemy would eventually land and search the area, but he had a few hours, at most, before they did. He looked back at Zyra, noticing that her breathing had steadied. She was still unconscious, but there was something about her that seemed different. Her presence had an undeniable energy to it, even in her weakened state. "Princess," he said, almost to himself. "What are you really doing here?" She stirred slightly at the sound of her title, but didn't wake. Her alien features were peaceful now, the strain from earlier gone. She wasn't like anyone James had ever known. He had seen his share of strong, tough individuals in his life, but there was something about Zyra that felt otherworldly. She wasn't just a princess in a distant galaxy. She was someone with a purpose, someone who carried the weight of her world on her shoulders. Just as he was about to turn back to his ship, a low rumble shook the ground beneath him. It wasn't from the ships. It was something closer. The earth trembled, and before he could react, a creature appeared from the shadows, large and covered in thick, rocky armor. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and it growled as it stepped into the cave's entrance. It was a predator, something James had never seen before. His hand went to the blaster at his side, but before he could aim, Zyra stirred. Her eyes shot open, and she looked directly at the creature, her face calm but determined. "Stay back," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange authority. James blinked in surprise. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Zyra didn't answer. Instead, she stood up slowly, her body swaying as she faced the creature. The glow from her skin intensified, and James could feel the air around them begin to shift, almost like a pressure building. For a moment, he thought the creature might back down, but instead, it charged, its claws reaching for Zyra. In the blink of an eye, Zyra raised her hand, and the creature stopped in its tracks. It froze, as if something was holding it back, its body shaking as it let out a low, menacing growl. "Go!" Zyra said firmly, her voice resonating with power James had never heard before. The creature hesitated for a moment, before turning and running into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had come. James was speechless. He stared at Zyra, who had returned to her earlier position against the cave wall, breathing heavily but otherwise unaffected.
"How did you do that?" James asked, his voice full of awe. Zyra's eyes met his, but there was no joy in her expression.
She only looked tired. "My people have abilities," she said softly. "I am not just a princess. I am a guardian of my people's legacy. And right now, I need your help to save them." James nodded, though he still didn't understand. The situation was growing more complicated by the minute. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary alien princess, and he wasn't going to back down from the fight. The next few hours passed in a tense silence. James and Zyra sat in the cave, the only sound being the distant hum of the Kavari ships as they searched the area. The wind howled through the rocks, but James was too focused on the situation to feel the cold. He kept his eyes on the horizon, waiting for any sign of movement. The night seemed endless. Zyra remained quiet, her eyes closed in what seemed like deep concentration. Her glowing skin had dimmed, but she was still visibly exhausted. James could tell she was struggling to stay awake. But there was a certain strength in her posture, a strength that he admired. She had saved them from the creature earlier, but he still had no idea how. Her people must be far more advanced than he had imagined. "Why did you call yourself a guardian earlier?" James finally asked, breaking the silence. "You're not just a princess. What does that mean?" Zyra's eyes opened slowly, and she looked at him, her expression unreadable. "My people are not like humans," she said, her voice calm but serious. "We are born with certain abilities. Some of us are gifted with powers to protect and defend. I am one of those who carries the weight of our people's legacy. I protect my world and my people. James leaned back against the cave wall, processing her words.
So, you're some sort of soldier or warrior?
Zyra shook her head slightly. Not exactly. A guardian is different. We are trained to guide and protect. But our main duty is to preserve the balance. When the Coterie attacked, they were after more than just me.
They wanted to destroy everything my people have built. If they succeed, my people will be lost.
James frowned. Why didn't you tell me all this before? I didn't know if I could trust you, Zyra admitted. But you saved my life, and that changes things. I can't do this alone. James's mind raced. He had no idea how to fight a fleet like the Covaris. He was just a man trying to survive. But Zyra was different. She wasn't just a princess in danger. She was someone with a purpose. Someone who had the power to change the course of the galaxy. And somehow, he had become a part of that. We need to get off this planet, James said finally. Your ship is wrecked, but there must be something nearby we can use to communicate with the outside world. If we can reach a station or a colony, we might be able to get help. Zyra nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. There is a place, she said after a moment. A hidden station. It's far from here, but it could be our best chance. James raised an eyebrow.
And you know where it is? I do, Zyra replied. But it's not easy to reach.
The path is dangerous, and the Kavari are likely already searching for it. James stood up, brushing the dirt off his clothes. Dangerous is nothing new to me. Zyra gave him a small, faint smile. Then, let's go. They left the cave and made their way across the rocky terrain, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The Kavari ships were still patrolling the area, their searchlights sweeping across the ground. James kept low, guiding Zyra as they moved through the rugged landscape. He could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. If they didn't reach the station soon, they would be caught. And if they were caught, it would mean the end of any hope for survival. As they walked, Zyra explained more about her world and her people. She spoke of the Velsha dynasty, a peaceful and prosperous civilization that had thrived for centuries. But the Kavari Dominion had always been a threat, a ruthless empire that sought to control and conquer. The Velsha had been able to defend themselves for a long time, but now, with the Kavari targeting Zyra directly, everything was at risk. James listened carefully, trying to understand the bigger picture. He had never cared much for politics or galactic empires. His life had been about survival, about doing whatever it took to stay alive. But Zyra's story was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her people, her entire world. And now, whether he liked it or not, James was involved. They walked for hours, the night stretching on endlessly. Zyra was slowing down, and James could see the toll the journey was taking on her. She was still injured, and the strain of using her abilities earlier seemed to have drained her further. He wanted to offer her more support, but he didn't know what else he could do. All he could offer was his strength and determination. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, they reached a narrow canyon. Zyra led them down a hidden path, and James could see the entrance to the station ahead. It was well hidden, built into the side of a cliff, and covered in thick vines and foliage. James's heart skipped a beat. They had made it. But just as they were about to approach the entrance, a loud noise echoed through the canyon. James's instincts kicked in, and he immediately pulled Zyra behind a large rock, shielding her from view. He peeked around the corner, his heart racing. The Kavari ships were close. Too close! We have to move, James whispered urgently. Zyra nodded, her face pale with fear. We can't let them find us here. The station will be lost. James looked around, his mind working quickly. There had to be a way to distract the enemy, to buy them enough time to reach the station. But the ships were everywhere, and they were closing in fast.
We'll have to fight our way in,
James said, his voice grim.
Stay close. We don't have much time.
Zyra nodded, her glowing skin faintly pulsing in the low light. She was ready, and so was he.
Together, they would face whatever came next. The Coterie might have more soldiers, more ships, but they didn't have the one thing that could make all the difference: determination. James was ready to fight, no matter what it took. The canyon was quiet. Too quiet. James and Zyra crouched behind the large rock, their breaths shallow as the sound of the Coterie ships grew louder. James peered around the corner, his heart pounding. The ships were circling the area, their searchlights scanning every inch of the terrain. He could feel the weight of their approach, like a storm closing in on them. "We need to move," James whispered urgently. "We can't stay hidden for much longer." Zyra nodded, her face tense with fear. She was exhausted, but there was a spark in her eyes. Determination. She had survived far worse than this, and she wasn't going to let herself be captured now. James glanced back at the entrance to the hidden station. They were so close. But it might as well have been miles away with the Coterie closing in. If they didn't act fast, they would be surrounded. "You stay behind me," James said, his voice low but firm. "I'll make sure they don't spot us." Zyra didn't argue. She had learned to trust James over the past few days, though he was a human and far less powerful than the warriors she had grown up with. She could see his strength, the quiet kind of strength that came from surviving everything the galaxy could throw at him. They moved quickly, staying low and quiet, using the shadows to their advantage. James was already thinking ahead. The Coterie ships were not just looking for them. They were looking for something more. Something Zyra had that they wanted. The station was their best chance to turn things around. But it was also their most dangerous. If the Coterie found it, everything would be over. James could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. They had to get inside, but he didn't know what kind of trouble they would face once they did. As they neared the station, James held up a hand, signaling Zyra to stop. He crouched low, scanning the area around them. The entrance was in sight, but the searchlights from the ships were moving closer. There was no way to get to the station without being seen. "We need a diversion," James muttered to himself. He scanned the ground for anything he could use. His eyes fell on a pile of rocks nearby. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He pointed toward the rocks.
"I'll set up a diversion. You go to the entrance."
"Once you're inside, I'll follow." "Are you sure this will work?" "It has to," James replied. "The only other option is getting caught. And that's not happening." Zyra gave him a determined nod. "Be careful." James gave her a quick smile before slipping off toward the rocks. He moved quickly, setting up a small pile of stones near a ridge. The Coterie ships were getting closer, their engines humming loudly as they scanned the canyon. He didn't have much time. Once he was in position, James took a deep breath. He lifted a rock and threw it as hard as he could toward a distant ledge. The noise echoed through the canyon, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the Coterie ships responded. One of them shifted its course, flying straight toward the source of the sound. It worked. The ship moved away from their path, giving James and Zyra the opening they needed. He looked back at her, signaling that it was time to go. Zyra ran toward the entrance, her glowing skin fading into the shadows. James followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. The station was just a few steps away now. They reached the entrance, and Zyra pressed her hand against a hidden panel beside the door. The door opened with a soft hiss, and they quickly slipped inside. The interior was dark, but the air was cool and fresh. It felt like a safe haven, for now. They had made it inside, but their journey wasn't over yet. James knew they had to act fast. The Coterie weren't far behind, and once they realized the diversion was a trick, they would be back. "We need to find a way to contact your people," James said, his voice low.
"Can you do that?"
Zyra nodded. "I can try. The station has a communications system, but it's old. It might not be enough to reach my world, but it's our only chance. James followed her deeper into the station, staying alert. The walls were lined with ancient technology, some of it still flickering with faint light. The station had clearly been abandoned for a long time. But there was still a sense of life here, a sense of hope. Zyra approached the terminal and began working quickly. Her fingers moved over the controls, her eyes focused on the screen as she tried to access the system. James watched her, his thoughts racing. The Kavari were not going to give up easily. They had a plan, and they were hunting for her. The moment they found out where she was, they would strike. "Come on," Zyra muttered under her breath. "Work." James crouched by the door, listening for any signs of movement outside. He could still hear the faint hum of the Kavari ships in the distance. It was only a matter of time before they realized they had been tricked. Just as he was about to turn back to Zyra, the door to the station's main chamber slid open with a soft hiss. James froze. Someone was coming. His hand went to his blaster instinctively, but before he could make a move, a voice called out from the shadows.
You're not alone, are you?
James tensed, his body ready for a fight. But as the figure stepped into the light, he saw that it wasn't an enemy. It was a man, dressed in worn clothes, his face tired but determined.
I knew someone would show up eventually, the man said, his voice rough. You're lucky you found this place before the Kavari did.
You're here. I didn't think anyone else would be left. The man smiled, though it was a sad, weary smile. I've been keeping watch for years, waiting for the day someone would come to fight back. James glanced at Zyra, his mind spinning. This was not just a station. It was a refuge, and they weren't alone after all.